In every age, there seems to be a small group of people who have the capacity to rise above the fray and give extraordinary leadership.
Maynard, in my opinion, paved the way for this city to become what it has become in the 21st century.
His agenda was equality. Go for equality. That there's room at the table for everybody. Everybody has to get a piece of the pie.
He was a presence. I mean, he was young, vivacious, and he just was fearless.
I don't think Maynard Jackson got credit for half the things, probably more than half the things that he did.
He's been called a visionary, courageous, humanitarian, ambitious, and an icon of the great city he helped fashion. He was known as a man of letters, a race man, inclusive, a role model, and a mentor. Three-term Atlanta mayor, Maynard Holbrook Jackson Jr., was all of that and more. Hello, I'm Shirley Franklin. I had the honor of serving Atlanta as the city's first female mayor from 2002 to 2010. It was a goal I could not have dreamed of reaching, but for working with Mayor Maynard Holbrook Jackson as the city's Commissioner of Cultural Affairs and in later administrations as Chief Administrative Officer. Throughout, Maynard Jackson was a mentor and an inspiration. He still is. When Maynard was first elected mayor in 1973, he not only became the first African-American mayor of Atlanta, but at 35, the country's youngest mayor of any major city. And though his accomplishments are many and well documented in the public record, accomplishments like expanding opportunities for minorities and women in the hiring of city workers and contractors, giving neighborhoods a voice in city planning, expanding minority and female business enterprise opportunities, and transforming Atlanta's sleepy regional airport into an international powerhouse. His untimely death in June 2003, at the age of 65, did not afford him a chance to write and publish a memoir. I met Maynard Jackson when David Franklin moved to Atlanta to join Maynard's law firm. He became Maynard's friend and eventually his campaign manager and a key political advisor in 1973. I was privileged to hear many of the stories that have shed light on his life, stories that reveal a complex and determined man, and not only a political strategist, but a friend with a generous heart. I also had the opportunity, through an endowed chair at Spelman College, to interview more than 20 of Maynard's friends, as well as colleagues and staff members who served during his tenure as mayor. This documentary weaves together excerpts from nearly 16 hours of interviews from that project, what I've called Maynard H. Jackson Setting the Record Straight. And though it's impossible to capture a complete picture of his character and imprint on the city he loved, it is my hope that this tribute to Maynard contributes to filling in the outlines of his legacy, one that reaches far beyond the city of Atlanta and far beyond his lifetime.
It was simply in his DNA. He didn't have a choice. People think, well, it wasn't planned, it wasn't accidental, it was destined. He was destined. You think about it, his father was a Baptist minister and was one of the first African Americans to run for a elected position in Dallas, Texas. So his political activism was not new, serving the people was not new. His mother was a scholar. He was destined. He grew up with a grandfather who believed in the power of the ballot, and his father organized registration to vote and get out the vote in Dallas. So he was destined. He had all of the elements when he came into the opportunity. He was very well educated. Education was a high value in his family.
And so I suspect that just in terms of that fundamental ground in orientation and socialization and, development, it had to be very, very strong, because I know Maynard's family was a very strong family, very recognized and accomplished family in the arts and culture and politics and business. And so all of those things, I think, particularly in the context of Jim Crow South, just position someone to be fearless.
Some say Maynard Jackson was a boy genius. He graduated Morehouse College at 18. That he was motivated and had a strong work ethic were the birthright he inherited, one that would also fuel his political ambitions, push him to run for public office, and influence the principled way he governed.
One thing about Maynard, he had such big ideas. I learned that he never liked to shrink his ideas, regardless of what they were. He would take it all the way out, and you know that.
So what was his motivation for that? Where did that come from?
I think a lot of it comes from his family. Came from his family. He was in a very unique family of intellectuals, and they would talk about issues of the day. And his grandfather, would talk to me about his grandfather all of the time.
Boston University Law School proved more of a challenge. He left before graduating and worked a number of jobs, including selling encyclopedias. Even that job influenced and inspired others. Maynard went on to earn his law degree from North Carolina's Central University in Durham in 1964. He returned to Atlanta and worked for the National Labor Relations Board and Emory Community Legal Service Center. His passion for politics awakened.
He was motivated to do something after the assassination of Dr. King. And he knew that something had to be done. And he decided if it was going to be done, he had to do what he could to make it happen.
So he was motivated by external actions, by the assassination of King and the assassination of Kennedy, and he felt an obligation, you think? He wasn't a native of Georgia, so why?
No, he was a native human being. That's really what he was. And it was a very, very simple concept on his part. He didn't like what he was seeing, and how could you just not like it without doing something about it?
An expectation of civic engagement was also a part of his belonging to the 33 Degree Masons, a fraternal organization his grandfather, Dobbs, once led. At the time, the 33 Degree Masons had as much influence on African American society as the church. Membership taught him grassroots organizing, the value of involvement in community life, and expanded his relationships with community leaders to turn his dream of a life in politics into reality. In 1968, Maynard Jackson made what some considered an impulsive run for the U.S. Senate against the powerful Democratic incumbent, Herman Talmadge, a die-hard segregationist.
To take on Herman Talmadge, the stalwart of the Senate, and to campaign throughout Georgia, which was barely desegregated at the time.
In 1968.
Yeah.
He wanted Fulton County, and he did much better than a lot of new white senators who had run before and lost. So that was the beginning, I think, of a lot of black elected officials thinking about running for statewide positions.
Because he was perceptive enough to know that if he wanted name recognition, the quickest way to get it would be the first African American to run statewide in a race. And even though he got 20 or 25% of the vote, when that race was over, everybody knew Maynard Jackson.
A year later, he was elected Atlanta's vice mayor in a landslide with 1/3 of the white vote and 99% of the black vote. But that was far from his only quest. He co-founded a law firm, the first firm of African-American lawyers in Georgia history.
Some people just wanted to put us on retainer just to say we have retained a black law firm and would not send us any work. Maynard would not go along with that. He said, we want to do the work. We want to learn how to represent large corporations. We want to be a part of these deals. And that was, very important to us.
4 years later, in 1973, Maynard Jackson ran for mayor. Yet he was not the only African American on the ticket. He faced a formidable state senator, Leroy Johnson, the first black Georgia state senator since Reconstruction.
The campaign at the AU Center for a mock election to determine who AU Center students would support for mayor, and Senator Johnson or Maynard Jackson. So they came over and met the students with a huge rally and a huge presentation. And I remember it well. We all organized it and made it one hands down. Some 90% of the students supported Maynard Jackson. And after that, we all got involved in the elections in some form or fashion.
Maynard Jackson would face the incumbent mayor, Sam Massell, in a runoff. And though Massell was considered progressive, they ended up in a bitter contest with racial overtones as Massell's campaign pandered to white voters' fears with the slogan, "Atlanta's too young to die."
But a city too young to die. And, when I talked about that, I remember the billboards. When I talked about that to my friends, they said I was wrong. That had nothing to do with Maynard Jackson's color. How delusional was that?
How delusional was that? The ploy failed, and Maynard Jackson won the runoff with 59% of the vote and made history. At 35, he became the city's youngest and first African-American mayor, not only of Atlanta, but of a major southern city.
It was time for the city really to have a mayor that represented the majority of the people in the city.
We were labeled the Black Mecca, and we had all of the elements of that, but the void for the Black Mecca was in having an elected black leader at the helm. And Maynard filled that void.
He was a breakthrough. It was a difference in kind, not degree, from what went before. And when Maynard came in, suddenly the black community had more than a voice. It had control.
And I think while I was here last, I told the story of a very elderly woman who had to have assistance coming into his office. And when she arrived on his night with the mayor night, which I think was Mondays, she was silent, and it troubled him until he discovered that she was there just to see a black man sitting in the mayor's office.
The formula that Maynard used to win his election has been used to win every subsequent mayor's election in Atlanta, and that formula, I believe, has also been duplicated across the nation.
So why don't you describe it for us?
Well, basically what the formula is you build a coalition between the African-American vote and the liberal right vote. So it's a method of knocking on doors, phone banking, canvassing, and making sure that the African-American vote comes out to vote.
His election electrified, inspired people to get involved, some for the first time. He gave the marginalized a voice, and he was the pioneer of a movement of forward-thinking African-American leaders.
He recruited people from all over. He was one of the first elected officials to really utilize electronic media and television. And that just happened at the time that there were so many folks who were getting degrees, the credential group coming out with law degrees, master's degrees, degrees in urban administration, public administration.
Maynard sent a whole cadre of people out to run the world. And he was clear that they were going to go out and run the world. And he made you feel like you needed to go out and run the world.
You would see Maynard Jackson on television, and he was talking about a progressive type of government, progressive city, and so it attracted people to him and to the city. And that was a great thing for Atlanta, because he was an excellent salesman, and he was good for the Atlanta brand.
I think he had a big heart. I think he had a big vision, and he brought along other people. I think he knew that his legacy and the continued existence of Atlanta on the front edge would necessitate new people learning and doing things that would be beneficial to the generation coming forward.
The burden on him when he came into office at City Hall was just absolutely excruciating to contemplate, that he bore the dreams and hopes of that many people.
Still, even with these hopes and dreams, some corners of Atlanta gave his election a decidedly cooler, if not hostile, reception.
Shortly after he was elected, Jerry Elder came into my office holding a Western Union telegram. This is probably a story you've never heard. And her eyes were filled with tears. And she said, "I cannot show this to the mayor." And she handed it to me, and I can still feel the paper in my hand because it became red hot. It was addressed to Maynard Holbrook Jackson, Mayor of the City of Atlanta, City Hall, Atlanta, Georgia. And the message was, doo-dah, doo-dah, all the doo-dah day.
When we first got elected, we got a lot of death threats, and they were very serious back in 1974. And the ones that were really bad, we would have a kind of an alert for and stuff like that. And
I don't think most people realize that.
So the city of Atlanta at that time was very much an old white boys club. They didn't even have a wide distribution of the chances to non-African Americans. It was a very close, clubby place where people thought it was appropriate to even keep city contracts out of the Central Purchasing Bureau and in their own safes at home.
most people don't think about how he reorganized city government. We went from a weak mayor form of government to a strong mayor form of government.
And even though the new charter clearly placed all of the executive authority in the mayor, like our own state and federal government, there were people on the Board of Aldermen who went down with the ship. Until they resigned or weren't reelected, they never warmed to the idea. They viewed what Maynard was doing as a power grab.
The mayor was new to his position. The president of city council was new to his position. 8 of the 18 city council members were first-year council members. And then you overlay all of that with race, and you have a tremendous kind of a cauldron, unrealistic, high expectations on behalf of the black community, and really unfounded fears on behalf of the white community.
Maynard required change in how things were approached. He would go and meet with editorial boards and take them to task on what they had written, and tell them the truth and the facts of the matter. These people were not accustomed to being brought down a notch or told that they were telling untruths. That they were telling the story only from their perspective.
It was vicious. It was absolutely a vicious series of articles and condemnations. The state wanted to come in and create an airport authority to take over the airport, and it goes way back. And so they weren't kind to Maynard's efforts. They thought it was cronyism. They thought he was handing out contracts to his friends, etc. All of this stuff, and which wasn't the case.
Changing the ethos of the city, which was, the ethos was exclusive, inequality, and Maynard brought a Jackson ethos that said, no, diversity and inclusiveness.
They did a lot of behind-the-scenes maneuvering the next legislature after he was made mayor, elected mayor. And from that point on, they were determined they will try to get rid of it, you know. And, you know, we had a lot of investigations going on, but they never could get him there on anything like that. But they decided in the next session that they were going to not only term limit Atlanta, because they couldn't do that. They tried to do it just for the city of Atlanta. But they were informed by the federal government that it had to be across the board for all mayors.
I think the business community had a great deal of difficulty because when they saw Maynard visually, he looked like them.
You mean he was fair-skinned?
He was fair-skinned, he had straight black hair, and he was clean. He was so pressed. He was never wrinkled. I mean, he always looked like he had just been bathed and laundered and, you know, pressed. His French cuffs with his cufflinks, his ties, his suits, everything was immaculate. And so they thought of him, when they saw him, as someone who had the same thinking as they did. And then he began to talk, and he was talking about the least of these, as opposed to how do we make more money. He was talking about how do we include people, how do we have a tide that raises the level of inclusion for everyone and brings economic well-being to all people. How do we improve housing? How do we, how do we use the resources of the city to make life better?
Maynard had to absolutely open every door. It amazes me sometimes to think of all the things he had to do.
One of the most important things he did was the development of the joint venture concept to involve blacks in business areas where they had not been involved previously. And a lot of people would think that all Maynard wanted to do was to stick a black person in there, let him get a little piece of the pie in terms of the money, but that was not Maynard's goal. His goal was for blacks to learn how to do business. He wanted black lawyers to learn how to be involved in the bond business. You know, it wasn't just the issue of getting money. His idea was to take it on to its natural conclusion, that is, where blacks would be totally capable of handling these matters on their own if they were successful and fairly chosen by whatever entities involved. So, I mean, that kind of attitude you see replicated all over this country.
He loved Atlanta. His legacy was his courage to challenge the status quo, the courage of his conviction about certain issues, to be that lone voice, to be lonely at the top.
I don't think anybody else could have done that. I really don't. I don't believe that. Because of his commitment to it and his persuasiveness and his willingness to take on the big lines, you know. He told King and Spalding that you're going to have to joint venture with a minority law firm to get this business, and they said, we won't do it. And he said, okay. The next day they were out of the deal, and it was Kilpatrick. It was Kilpatrick, Cody Rogers, McClatchy, and Regenstein at the time. But the next day, they were handling the bond business for the city of Atlanta, and Patterson, Parks, and Franklin were the minority partners in that deal, you know. So that shows two things. He was determined that this was going to work, and secondly, he doesn't forget his friends.
And it was the only time I ever saw Maynard almost not care how he sounded. Because, you know, his use of words was always for fear that he would be recorded or quoted. And it just annoyed him so much that this person had a countenance hanging a sheet so that the black men would dress on one side and the white city workers would dress on the other. That was after he had relented and even accepted the hiring of black people. So it was one of the times that Maynard really had a field day.
Racial tensions weren't the only problems vying for Maynard's attention. The city itself needed help, from low-income housing to public transportation.
Fulton County is in charge of human services.
Right.
But what Maynard saw immediately was that the city was predominantly black and the county or nobody was dealing with the problems of the inhabitants of the city of Atlanta. So he established the Bureau of Human Services and asked me to be the director.
While he was reorganizing city government, there were a whole host of issues that he had to address, such as, people forget that there was a lot of crime in downtown, shootouts in downtown Atlanta on the streets, and public safety was a big priority.
He was ahead of his time, and it's unfortunate, I think, that at the time there was not this great appreciation for how he led this city through an era. There was Hartsfield who had the vision for Atlanta with the airport. And without that, we wouldn't be. There was Ivan Allen who was courageous and spoke about the Civil Rights Bill. What Maynard knew was for this city to be great, we needed to manage so very carefully the transition of power through the whole integration, racial integration. Yes. And that's what he stepped up to do.
America could not survive without the change, in my opinion. Racism is an evil. Racism debilitates the oppressor and the oppressed. There had to come a time when people began to put that behind us.
While some may have viewed Maynard Holbrook Jackson Jr. as a politician who only looked out for the African American community, he considered himself a race man in order to right historical wrongs, to open doors of opportunity in both government and business for those who had been previously shut out. He had a deep desire to be the mayor of all Atlantans, to unite the races, and he was considered an architect of the post-civil rights era.
I don't think that Maynard cared whether you were black, brown, green, or purple, as long as you had progressive ideas and you were about inclusion rather than exclusion.
His demand that the expansion of Hartsfield-Jackson Airport in the late 1970s include minority and women-owned businesses reflected his uncompromising commitment to inclusion. It was a project that went far beyond transforming a sleepy airport into the world's busiest.
The airport would not be what it is had it not been for Maynard Jackson. Atlanta needed a new airport terminal. It needed to expand its facilities, and the business as usual suggested that the bidding process would begin and that majority companies would receive the bids. And Maynard said, no, we're going to have a different process. We're going to have inclusion. 25% of this business should go to minorities, and he created the concept of joint ventures, which was then used by the FAA across the country. And so it changed literally the face of construction in this country.
He knew that aviation would continue to keep Atlanta in the forefront, both in tourism, in business, in cargo, in the sites and of people around the world. Having Atlanta's name on the board as you go into Paris, as you go into places in Africa and Europe and Asia is a big deal. And so the people get to know that Atlanta is not Atlantic City. Atlanta is a place where business thrives and where civil rights is a very important part of our legacy and our future.
Some famous quotes that have been documented by some film that weeds would grow on Hartsfield unless there was minority participation. So in fact, it happened, reluctantly, but it happened. And they said, we can't find qualified minority firms to do business, which was nonsense. And he convened a list of people, and they were included through joint ventures on these deals, and the airport was built. It was built on time, under budget, and was a major achievement.
So that there would be minority companies participating. And that trickled down to every other aspect of an airport. So the vendors, the concessions, all became a part of his legacy.
I mean, when you think about the airport, I mean, there is not a more powerful economic engine than that. And you think about how diverse Atlanta is today, that is not an accident. That's because a lot of hard decisions got made.
To honor his role in the airport's expansion, Jackson's name was added in 2003, 4 months after he died. Yet during the time the building was underway, a grim shadow was cast over Maynard's second term, the missing and murdered children's case.
The missing and murdered children had a deep and personal impact on Maynard. There was the management of it as it impacted the city, but he always personalized it because of his children, as many of us did. But he stopped traveling. He stopped doing speeches. I mean, he really modified his movement and his life.
But even with the strain of the tragedy and the national and international attention, Maynard Jackson retained hope for Atlanta's future as the next great international city and worked to make it so.
He had a perspective on international, the global world that most municipalities just didn't have.
At the time, no.
At the time, his whole Sister Cities initiative, his relationship with leaders in Africa. I mean, Maynard was so ahead of his time.
His Sister Cities initiative also raised Atlanta's visibility and stature around the world, with its cultural, educational, business, and technical exchanges.
I witnessed personally how people would call Mr. Jackson governors, presidents, international figures before they made decisions about things. I think he touched people across worldwide.
And in creating the Atlanta of the future, he made sure the city would be left in capable hands, those of former United Nations Ambassador Andrew Young, who would become his successor, a man also committed to expanding Atlanta's role on the world stage.
His vision for the city at that time, and Andy coming to be the mayor, I think is what put us on center stage in 1996. I'm not sure we would have had the Olympics. I think there would have been maybe a group of people with a great idea, but I'm not sure we would have had the Olympics without Andrew Young.
Well, without the two of them.
Well, without the two of them, right.
Because probably would not have had Andy as mayor without Maynard.
My point.
Exactly.
Yeah.
There's no question about it.
No, I think that was a defining moment when he persuaded, helped Andy see the light, as we say.
Yes.
But once Maynard Jackson left the mayor's office, no Atlanta law firm would hire him.
He became a partner at Chapman Cover. He did extremely well with them during that 8-year lull in between his first 2 terms and his 3rd term. But I think he was disappointed that the business community in this city wasn't big enough to embrace him and allow him to do everything he could have done for the city as an ambassador for the city if he had been with a local firm.
But when they needed help, they'd be the first people to come to Maynard and hire somebody to contact Maynard to work with them. And it turned out that he probably was a good thing he went with the firm that he went with, because it made more money than Atlanta firms, and he didn't have to deal with some of the problems.
And he called me about 3 years into this new job and said, I'm thinking about running for mayor again. And I said, why would you want to do that? You're making money.
You did a great job.
Right. So he decides to run again.
So what did he say? Why did he want to run?
He said that the city was not as strong politically. I mean, the mayor's office was not as strong politically as it should be.
Okay.
And he wanted to return that power to the mayor's office.
Right.
At that point in time, I think he felt that there were things still needing to be done. It wasn't that he had a passion to be mayor again for the sake of being mayor. He felt that there were things that were needed. He was very passionate about closing the economic divide between the well-off and not so well-off. I think he felt that the city still had room to grow in terms of being a great international city. You know, very ambitious. I mean, you know, you can never dream big enough for Maynard.
His dream included Atlanta's expansion as a business hub, a green space, a cultural mecca, not just to live in, but a destination city. And during Maynard Jackson's third term, he would also become instrumental in shaping and telling Atlanta's story to attract the 1996 Summer Olympic Games.
Maynard's impact on the Olympics was huge because I don't think that there'll ever be other Olympic Games where there are that many minorities playing significant roles, or where that many contracts will be let to diverse companies and entities, as was true in Atlanta.
He also considered the arts essential to the Olympics bid and to what made Atlanta a livable city for all. He cared so much about Atlanta's history and culture. He saved the historic Fox Theater from demolition. He was a commanding, charismatic presence.
One of the things I enjoyed doing, but also was problematic, is walking down the street with Maynard. Anywhere we would go, he liked people, so he would always stop. Hi, how are you? It's good to see you again. How's your mother doing? She cooked the best pie for me when I was over at your church, and I'd be sitting there saying, God, we gotta get moving.
We got out of the car, the homeless guys just crowded all around us. And here, just little me, here's Maynard, like here, I'm like right here. And these guys were, some of them, you could tell they were having mental problems. They were hallucinating and saying all type of stuff. And I said, well, Mayor, he saw me grab my radio. He said, put that up where? These men put on their pants just like you and I never forget that.
Yes, he helped shape my whole opinion about public service, about Atlanta and Atlanta's history. He taught a lot. Usually, whenever there was an assignment you would be given, you would always get a lesson about Atlanta's history, the people in Atlanta that helped shape it, and just about just being in politics, period.
He never met a stranger, and he treated everybody with dignity and respect, be it the doorman or the person that was picking up the garbage.
I remember one day there was a lady, he taught us about the Susie Labors, the Ethel Matthews. One of them had come to see him, and because it wasn't a business person, we didn't understand the value of who the Susie Labors and the Ethel Matthews and their contribution to Atlanta history. And as far as he was concerned, we didn't give her the kind of respect that he thought she deserved. So he pretty much called us in a little mini meeting and explained to us her history, how important the Susie Labors, the Ethel Matthews were to Atlanta, and what their contributions were, and how we should respect them like we would any high-level person. They deserve the kind of respect. And I guess that was the turning point for me in really appreciating all the contributions that all the different people made at different levels.
For him, the priority was the people. He listened to their issues and concerns and made sure his staff did the same.
That he wanted to elevate people who were less fortunate, that he wanted to involve all strata of society in government in issues. The NPU deal was very important to me. Maynard got me appointed to the Charter Commission in 1971, 72, and that was one of the things that he wanted. He said, I want neighborhood units to be involved in zoning issues and so forth and so on, and we got that.
He obviously put in place a whole system of, and it's represented by what happened around the Carter Center, but he obviously put in place a whole system of neighborhood planning. Now, I personally have some problems with where that has gone. I mean, I think that there are issues that a community, a city faces that are in fact bigger than just what a neighborhood wants. But I think there's no question that he tilted in the right direction by creating a system that gives a voice to neighborhood concerns, and he did it in what at the time was a very innovative way. I mean, there weren't very many places that were doing that.
People's Day. Once a month, we had a People's Day that anybody could come and talk. All the cabinet members would be there, lined up around, and the flood doors would open up, and just people would come in to see the mayor. And if they didn't see the mayor on their issue, they could see the police chief, or they could see the commissioner of Parks and Recreation, the different take care of the people's needs and stuff. So we'd always be there on People's Day, just for the people just to come without an appointment, to walk in for your time with the mayor, your 10 minutes with the mayor. And if you didn't get to the mayor, you get there, the others around to work on your.
So did he solve problems, or you just listen, or?
He listened. He'd write little notes and say, "Take care of this." You as commissioners or heads of departments or people around in charge of the thing, he'd make a note. You have an assignment. Staff would sit there with him, and they'd make notes of this person's problem, to direct problem. And at the end of People's Day, there were a lot of notes for us as staff people to deal with and get back to Ms. Jones or Mr. Jones, whatever it is, that we'd get back with them and say, "You were here, and this is where to resolve the problems."
He was very meticulous in advocating for neighborhood preservation and transit expansion. His advocacy was so clear about shifting the whole direction of transportation planning and development, the development course of the region, away from the highway system and toward the development of the transit system.
One of the things he once told me was, "I want to put a dentist in the airport." I said, "Why do you want a dentist in the airport?" He said, "Well, we ought to have all the services that anybody would need at the airport."
The thing that is the most impressive to me about Maynard is the fact that he always committed himself to contributing to youth. He always gave himself to young people. When Maynard passed away in 2003, I thought I held up real well until Cesar Mitchell got up at the memorial service at Morehouse and talked about a period of time where he was the president of the political science club, or the pre-law club, I think it was, at Morehouse. And he talked about the fact that he had done everything he could to get a big turnout because Maynard was coming to speak. And he had put out flyers, and he had called people, and at the end of the day, about 6 or 7 people showed up, and he was very embarrassed. And he talked about the fact that Maynard stayed there and talked to those 6 or 7 people like he was talking to an auditorium with 500 people in it.
I think he gave up a lot of his personal life to invest in the lives of his people, and I think that was his calling. I think he fulfilled that. I think he was purposeful in doing that, and he left a legacy of entrepreneurs. He left a legacy of great black businessmen, and I think he made left a legacy on the city of Atlanta in terms of furthering its growth. And I think he just made an investment. He did that through the Maynard Jackson Youth Foundation, through students who are far surpassing what they ever envisioned they would be able to do without him impacting their lives.
All along, Maynard Jackson tirelessly, painstakingly drove himself. He was a stickler for details with a total commitment to to the public trust and a command of the issues the city faced. And he instilled that mentality in the people around him.
And he would not be shy about correcting my information if it was wrong. I remember one day I was going in to talk to him about some legislation. And he asked me a question about it, and I made the wrong statement. I said, well, Mr. Mayor, I assume that this occurred. He said, let's stop right now. You did what? You assumed? He said, I'm making a very important decision on your recommendation, and you are telling me you're not prepared. You come in with an assumption that could be wrong. And if I make a decision on your wrong assumption, then I am going to have to pay for your misinformation. Don't ever come in here like that. So either you tell me you know or you don't know. And if you don't know, that's fine. Go find the answer.
Everybody on our detail, executive protection detail, he required you to have a library card. And he gave us, I think it was either 5 or 6 days to get a card. And he would come around and check. He asked you to open up your wallet and ask for your library card. And some of the guys didn't want to do it. I didn't want to do it. But anyway, that motivated me to read.
We joked about it and called it, you went to the Maynard Jackson University. And it truly was. I mean, because you learned English, you learned etiquette, you learned, just all the things that most jobs, you're going there and you do the task. But I learned hospitality from him. I learned that he was impartial, whether you were a janitor, whether you were a sanitation worker, or whether you were an elected official or an international figure. There was no partiality. You treated everyone the same. I learned to respect all people.
He loved to keep the city clean. That would probably be one of his highlights, because a week would not pass by. We would go down a different street and he would just get out and just start picking up paper, picking up cans.
When he asked you to get someone on the phone, you didn't just try the first number and say, okay, I called the business number and they're not there. You called every number you had, because if you went back to him and say, I can't reach them, his response would be, well, are they on the face of the earth? So the way to deal with that is just call every number you could think of, and then when you go to him, I would say, I've called the house number, I've called this number, I've called that number. In other words, I've called every number we had, and we can't reach the person. And then I think he would be satisfied with, I can't reach. That
So
you couldn't reach anybody.
He didn't really see limits then. I mean, he's the kind of person who thought you really needed to go the last step.
Yes, you did not go back to him without doing your checks and balances. You made sure your I's were dotted and your T's were crossed.
One of his favorite sayings was, if you can see the line, then you're too close to it. So, I mean, he was definitely not going over the line.
He was not going over the line.
He really was a conservative person, business-wise, and as far as his own integrity was concerned.
From the collar to the tip of his toe to his cufflinks, he was as well groomed in his hair and his presentation. He was as articulate and he was as unyielding, and principled. I think even his enemies would say principled. But I think in the end, what really annoyed them was that so many of them were cynics who assumed that anyone in public life, maybe anyone in their private lives, had a price. They only had to figure out what the price was. And if you paid it, they would go away. They could not figure out what Maynard's price was. And some of them would be so bodacious as to say to me after a meeting, what does he really want? And I would say what he just said.
Certainly here in Atlanta and elsewhere, Maynard was recognized by many people across the country for his efforts. in Atlanta and how that impacted their communities. He later ran for the chair of the Democratic Party and taking on a new frontier of challenges. And you recall that as well. And he wanted to change the Democratic Party and to get it more grassroots oriented and more centered with people's needs. And he lost that race or withdrew from it, but he had an impact on it. And I remember, I think I brought a copy of it. I remember you were up in Washington at the time when the caucusing was going on for that race. And he didn't have a snowballing chance of winning, but he was going to go for it. And people told him he should drop out and so forth, but other people said hang in there. He was trying to bring inclusion within the party. Inclusion within the party. Now how, you can have an African-American leader of the Democratic Party. Well, where we are in 2010, 2008 with the election of Barack Obama. All right, if it had not been those kinds of seeds that Maynard planted.
Not only did Maynard Jackson lead, he created organizations to mentor leaders, like the National Association of Securities Professionals, known as NASP. And he believed in giving back and leading by example.
He didn't have to start NASP. He was already Maynard Jackson. He could walk in any door, anywhere in the country, to any elected official. He could get business. But what he wanted to do was to start an association so that these people who had previously been excluded would have an opportunity to network among themselves and use their collective power to advance collectively.
Maynard not only was a person who led the city of Atlanta, but he led the nation. I will never forget the role that he played in the National League of Cities, and how he established the first caucus in the National League of Cities, which was the NBC-LEO, National Black Caucus of Local Elected Officials. And even after, during the interim when he was not mayor, he attended every one of the conferences. And he was instrumental again in my becoming the first female, well, the second black president of the National League of Cities. Behind the scenes again.
I mean, he was considered the dean of African American mayors. And he set the bar so high that everyone aspired to do maybe half as well as Maynard. Because when you think about the context and time when he was mayor, he was absolutely brilliant at it.
He knew perhaps he had a legacy to uphold, the Dobbs name, the family's commitment to self-improvement and civic well-being. He also had his own aspirations for Atlanta to realize.
He is who he was raised to be. There was no way he could be different coming out of the Dobbs family. He was raised to be a leader.
I think much of what we saw about Maynard's view of the world really came from being reared by the 6 Spelman women. Maynard's sympathy, empathy, his touch, I think, very much had to do with being surrounded by women, educated women, who he knew to be capable of doing anything they put their minds to. And that did seep over into his public operations, because he appointed women to non-traditional jobs. I sit here as the first female city attorney in Atlanta. It never dawned upon him that I should have a check mark against me because I was female.
His sudden death made many look at themselves and at the city in a new light, as a reflection of his.
I have told some of my grandchildren this, that he was somebody who made me look in the mirror and see more than the image. He made me examine my feelings and the feelings of people who look like me.
He taught me to believe that all is possible. I mean, you are not going to get what you want in any area of life unless you're committed to it and you're willing to put all of your resources behind getting it done, no matter how audacious ridiculous it may seem, he taught me that everything was possible, you know, if you worked for it and you believed in it and you were committed to it.
To get educated, to go on and make something of yourselves and keep what he started going.
Maynard actually made me feel good about the leadership of the city and new direction for the city because he was so clear. And in a way, I think he seemed to feel it so viscerally, what he felt about the city and defending it and advocating.
I believe in political polling today in Metro Atlanta, he's probably still one of the most influential person. I mean,
so if you
still one of the most influential people in political campaigns to this day.
Till this day.
And he's dead.
We lost a real leader then, and I don't mean we just lost the politician. I mean we lost a real leader.
Maynard Holbrook Jackson Jr. may have been misunderstood in his lifetime, but with each year that passes, his legacy perhaps becomes clearer. He was the leader Atlanta needed at the time to heal the wounds still opened by segregation so that Atlanta could live up to its image as a phoenix rising from the ashes, ready to take its place on the world stage.
An elected official is, especially a mayor, is a deliverer of the goods because in a city government, you are engaged far more in the delivery of basic services than one would be in a legislative position. The elected official's job is to be accountable, to be dedicated, to be honest, and to try to change the inequities overnight. Now, you don't have to be crazy to be mayor, you know, but it helps. And you just, you know, it's kind of almost like a form of masochism when you run for re-election as mayor. Now, there are different kinds of jobs in politics. The best in the country is to be in the U.S. Senate, in my opinion. The worst job in politics in terms of how much you really have to sacrifice of yourself, your time, your family, and so forth is the position of mayor. You're smack up front, on that front line, the firing line. It never stops. You're on target 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And on the other hand, the compensation is that if you're in a strong mayor form of city government, as we are here in Atlanta, you can really see changes begin to take place because you can make your imprint. You can see your policies begin to take shape.